So I'm going to look at the system of car control again today. We've looked at system previously in an introduction to the system of car control. In that video we looked at the 5 phases of the system of car control: information, position, speed, gear and acceleration, how you apply those in some everyday situations. We mostly did roundabouts in that video. Today I'm going to look at a particular aspect of system that a lot of people struggle with at first when they're trying to change or adapt their driving style to a systematic style, and that particular aspect is brake gear overlap. If you drive into the system, most of the time, 95% of the time, you should be avoiding overlapping your braking and your changing gear, by which I mean, quite simply, you shouldn't be braking and changing gear at the same time. So when you're on the speed phase, you should get your speed correct for a hazard before you come off the brakes, and then take the gear for the hazard and then accelerate or apply a small or the correct amount of acceleration to clear the hazard. So a lot of people struggle with this because most people in their everyday driving have got completely used to braking and changing gear at the same time, and indicating and sometimes steering into a junction. People overlap those different phases and do them all at the same time. If you are looking to pass a driving test, an advanced driving test, like the Institute of Advanced Motorist Test or ROSPA's driving test, or if you're looking to pass an emergency services driving course, police or ambulance, something like that, there is an expectation that you will be able to drive to the system and almost completely remove brake gear overlap from your driving. There are benefits, clear benefits to removing brake gear overlap. The 2 main benefits are that, firstly, if you separate your braking and gear changing, when you come off the brakes, you will allow the car to settle to its correct speed whilst you take the gear before you drive through the hazard. Second main advantage is that you can then take your foot from the brake and use it on the accelerator to smooth out the gear change, and we've looked at that in another video as well. If you look at the gear changing, how to change gear video, you'll see how we use the accelerator to smooth out gear changes. You can't do that very well while your foot's still on the brake. There is a technique called heel and toe that we'll probably look at in another video. But for ordinary road driving and for IAM and ROSPA and police driving courses and all that kind of thing, heel and toe isn't really a recognised technique. What we're looking to do is separate braking and changing gear. Now, there's no big secret to sorting out brake gear overlap. There's no big secret to learning the technique. It's just practice. But there are particular things that you need to bear in mind when you're practicing. And that's what we're going to look at today. So we're going to go over to a junction that I regularly used to use when I was teaching police officers, still use it now if I'm teaching other people how to practice system. And it's a very, very straightforward left turn into a junction. The key thing that you've got to get into your head is a point on the road where you want to be off the brakes. And that point on the road where you're off the brakes will then give you enough time before you arrive at the hazard, or arrive at the left turn in this case, to change gear. So instead of planning to be at the right speed just as you turn into the junction, we're planning to be at the right speed a short distance before the junction, so that you can come off the brakes, change gear whilst you're still travelling in a straight line towards the junction, so that you then remove your foot from the clutch, you're in the correct gear before you actually turn into the junction and accelerate away. So that's what we're going to have a look at today. Okay, so I've come out to use a little section of sort of 4 roads. Really it's just to run around the block, and this, if you're going to practice system and you're going to sort of try and get yourself into the habit, get yourself away from having to actually think about applying system to the point where I suppose muscle memory's kicked in, where you're not really having to think about it very much, then you're going to have to do something repetitive like this exercise that I'm going to show you. So I've picked a section of road where there's basically it's just to run around the block, but the benefit of this particular junction that we're going to look at is that it is a faster road. So if memory serves me right, it's national speed limit. We'll have a look. It's either national or 50. and you're turning from that faster road into quite a tight turning, so you need to lose quite a lot of speed before changing gear and then turning into the junction. So the first thing we're going to do is have a look at I suppose how not to do it, if you like. Sort of demonstrate the technique that most people develop as they're driving when they've been driving for a few years, and it's the sort of technique that you commonly see when people come to you having not had any advanced instruction before. There's the junction, there's the sign for the junction. So what you'll typically see from people when they normally turn into a junction like this is they leave the braking fairly late and they brake right up to the junction, and they leave the braking right on until they get to the junction like this, and then just at the last minute they'll change gear while they're still on the brakes. The steering will be all to cock and everything's done at the last minute. Now actually, if you think about it, it's not a particularly dangerous manoeuvre, but everything's done at once. Everything's sort of rushed in at the last minute and the technique isn't very good. And actually, if we apply system correctly, we can make things much smoother, balance the car much better throughout the hazard, and we're just making life easier for ourselves. Now, I always used to say to police students that it might feel a little bit clunky and a little bit awkward at first. What they found was that when they moved on to later on in the course, when the speeds were higher, when perhaps they were doing emergency response driving, that separating that speed phase and that gear phase out made far much more sense. So in other words, you would stay on the brakes until you could see it was clear to go through a gap or to pass some vehicles, and then you'd get the gear to go. So this time, with the cameras where they are, I'm going to demonstrate the correct technique, and then we're going to talk about how you mentally prepare yourself to apply that technique, and then how you actually apply it in reality. Okay, so this time we're going to apply the correct technique. We're going to separate everything out, checking the mirrors, put a left signal on in a minute for the junction. There's the sign for the junction to the left. Put a left signal on now. Now I'm braking. I'm going to get the speed down early, and I'm going to come off the brakes now with enough time to change gear and come off the clutch and then turn into the junction. Keep an eye on the Land Rover. We're not really applying the brakes any earlier than we would do using the incorrect technique. What we are doing is coming off the brakes earlier, so that we're completely off the brakes for a few yards, which is just enough distance for us to change gear and come off the clutch, and then everything's done before you turn into the junction. Okay, so we'll just look at that again now, the correct technique, the camera in a slightly different position. So you've got pretty much my view through the windscreen, but I'll also put my feet on the screen so that you can see where I'm starting to brake. Most important thing is to look at where I'm finishing braking, so that I've got enough time to get the gear. So we're looking ahead now, the road's bending around to the right. I know that the junction I'm going to turn into is further up the road. So the approach to a right-hander, I'm going to position towards the near side just to get a better view into the corner. Keep that near side view on the approach. There's the sign for the junction. So I'm starting the planning phase now as to where I'm going to brake and then come off the brakes. Checking the mirrors. Put a signal on in a second for following traffic about here. On the brakes now, firming the braking up. Now I'm easing off the brakes and coming off the brakes now with enough time to turn into the junction. You'll notice that one thing I do is press the clutch early while we're still in the braking phase. That's fine. We're in a high gear, 5th gear. If I don't press the clutch and we bring the speed right down, then the engine's going to go below its comfortable tick over speed, and you're going to get that sort of jerky motion, that juddering that you tend to get when you let the vehicle's revs drop too low. So one little instructional technique that I use when I'm teaching system to somebody who's not familiar with it, and we're trying to get rid of the brake gear overlap, is to encourage them to imagine a spot, a fixed point on the road at which point they've got to have all the braking completed by. So, you know, most average drivers, most normal drivers with no additional instruction, that point will be the junction itself. In their mind, they've got to have the speed correct at the point they get to that junction. For us, with advanced driving, I ask them to sort of pull that point back from the junction a little bit. 10 feet, 15 feet, 20 feet, dependent on how long they think they need to change gear. The idea being that at that fixed point before the junction, your speed will be correct. Come off the brakes, you've then got enough time to change gear and come off the clutch before you turn into the junction. So what I've done this time round is I've put a small traffic cone out at the point where I come off the brakes, and this is the point that you need to imagine when you're practicing your system. I mean, by all means put something out if you like. In this case actually there's a little hedge line that marks the point next to where the cone will be. So I'm looking ahead now. You should just about be able to see the cone in the distance. That's the point I need to finish my braking by. Checking the mirrors, putting a left signal on. I'm starting to brake now. I'm firming up the braking, pressing the clutch. When I get to the cone, I'm off the brakes, just with enough time to change gear and turn into the junction. So let's do that again. So looking ahead, trying to pick out where the junction is. There's the sign for the junction. There's our little cone. Checking the mirrors, putting a left signal on, starting to brake now. I want to get my braking firmed up in the middle and then easing off towards the end so that I'm off the brakes by the time we get to the cone. I have enough time to take second gear and come off the clutch before we turn into the junction. So one final demonstration of this straightforward left turn now. Looking ahead, checking the mirrors, moving to the near side to get a good view into this right-hander. There's the sign for the left-hander, the warning sign. Checking the mirrors. There's the little cone in the distance. We're easing off now, putting a left signal on. Now we're on the speed phase. Firming the braking up in the middle, easing off the brakes, and now I'm off the brakes by the time we get to the cone. Clutch up, and we're in the correct gear before we turn into the junction. Now when you see it demonstrated by somebody who's been doing it for years, it does seem extremely straightforward, but believe me, when you start practicing, and those of you that have started practicing or are undergoing training, advanced driver training, will know that it is nowhere near as easy as it looks. The technique is easy when you've got somebody next to you telling you what to do, but as soon as they stop talking and telling you what to do, it becomes nigh on impossible to remember to remind yourself to separate your braking and changing gear. So my advice is go out, find yourself a little spot like that where you can drive around the block, you can do the same junction over and over again. Pick yourself a spot on the road that you need to be off the brakes by, that will give you enough time to change gear before you turn into the junction. It might seem like an extremely basic technique at this stage, but when you start moving on to the more advanced techniques, you start moving on to applying it to different kinds of hazards, you'll see that it makes more and more sense, and that it's a really good technique to learn and to try and master. So that's it for today. Thanks for watching. We'll try and get some more stuff uploaded over the next few weeks. I've a little bit more spare time now. I've finally finished editing and publishing the new book. Bob over to Amazon, have a look. There's a new book out. It's called How Not to Crash. Clues in the name, really. I've looked at the most common mistakes that people make when they're driving, lead up to accidents, and written a short piece on how to avoid those mistakes and how to spot other people making those mistakes and to avoid getting involved in somebody else's accident as well. So if you've got the first book, Advanced and Performance Driving, bob over to Amazon, have a look. You can read the first couple of chapters for free. Might be up your street. But for now, I'm Reg Local, and thanks very much for watching. See you next time.